All right. If we could just move along to the agenda, Max. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We are really excited to have you all here for our 2025 Pathways webinar, where we're going to go over the guidelines and application process for Pathways. We are joined today by Heather Lubov, our Executive Director at City Parks Foundation, as well as Emily Sherrod, who is the Partnerships Development Director for City Parks Foundation. Billy Fiddler, who is our he's in charge of our campaigns. He's our campaign director. He's with us today. We have him to thank for the funds that we are able to redistribute through this fund. And we've also got Max Can here, who is the executive coordinator. So thank you all for joining from the CPF side. Really excited to be here with all of the attendees today. And Heather's gonna provide a Green Fund update for you all. And then Emily will kindly provide a sort of strategy and guidelines where we're at right now with Pathways moving forward. I'll go ahead and provide an application overview as well as some examples of past projects. And then once we get through all of that, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and provide you guys with some answers. And just as a reminder to folks, there's also going to be there's a chat that's being moderated as well. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Heather and we can get started.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Green Fund and where we are now. The Green Fund is a pooled grant program, which means that we are raising money from multiple sources, primarily foundations, and then redistributing that in the form of grants. We have about 20 supporters at this point, and the funder committee is chaired by Chelsea Smith from the Altman Foundation and Arturo Garcia Costas from the New York Community Trust. They co-chair the committee of funders, and it's the funders themselves who make the decisions about the grant proposals. We are the administrator, but it is really the funders that are scoring and deciding who gets the grants. Last year, we gave away just over $2 million in grants. That broke out to about 185 grants to grassroots groups, to mid-sized nonprofits, and to organizations interested in systems change, as you all are today. We also, along with the Green Fund, during COVID, created a coalition called the New York City Parks and Open Space Partners that organizes conservancies and alliances and other nonprofit organizations that work within the parks and open space arena as a way of sharing resources and helping establish best practices. We've offered scholarships to things like Fundraising Day. We've offered subsidized memberships to Nonprofit New York and resources at the support center. So it's all about building capacity of the many nonprofits that work in parks and open spaces. Let's go to the next slide. And then you can see, of course, the Green Fund is split up into 3 different buckets of funding. Grassroots, which is for groups that have budgets of either $0 up to $175,000. We have a lot of groups like that. There are more than 500 groups that we work with to provide support and capacity building resources. Many of them are purely volunteer groups with no budget whatsoever. Our Treetops program, which provides programming support for nonprofits that have budgets between $175,000 and $2.5 million. We do not support groups in that program with budgets of larger than $2.5 million. The goal is to really help support the groups that need us most. And then, of course, we are here today to talk about the Pathways program, which is really meant to address policy changes and changes in how parks and open spaces are funded. So with that, I will turn things over to Emily.
Thank you, Heather. I'm Emily Sherrod here with City Parks Foundation. So as Heather mentioned, we're here today to talk about the Pathways Grant Program specifically. The goal of this grant program itself is to build a more equitable and vibrant open space system across the city. And there's two main ways that we intend to fund to get to that goal ultimately. The first is about bringing in more funding for the open space sector at large. And the second is about making it easier for place-based partners to do business with the city. So championing and supporting non-governmental partners. Success in either type of these projects would look like either more funding or greater power sharing between the city and the place-based partners across the city. Max, if you want to hop to the next slide. Awesome, thank you. And then in terms of what projects like this could look like, it could look like anything from changing policies, as Heather mentioned, so identifying and trying to implement policy changes or regulatory measures, or it could look like building and supporting a coalition of organizations to advocate for systems change work, or it could look like conducting research or implementing communication strategies to reach either increased funding, whether that's public or private funding for the open space sector, or making it easier for partners to do business with the city. So there's kind of two main goals of this, and there's a lot of different ways that you could reach those two goals towards the end of it. And later on in our presentation today, Vanessa will talk through a couple of the past projects so that you can see some concrete examples of what that's looked like. I'm going to pass it back to Vanessa now to talk through what applicant eligibility looks like for this Pathways Grant Program.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Heather. All right, so we're going to get more into the application, what you can expect to see there. Just to reiterate with everyone, this information is available on the guidelines as well, the guidelines and application document that we put out on the 28th, Friday of last week. And just to remind everyone, you'll get more reminders as well, but we also have options for consultations to get into the details of these things more. But when just starting with the application, when you do start that application online, you're first going to see a set of eligibility questions. And with those questions, we're looking to understand if the proposed project meets at least one of those two programmatic goals that Emily mentioned. So we're really focusing on securing revenue for parks and open spaces, and we're looking at informing policy that impacts parks and open spaces, and really creating more access to those spaces. We're accepting applications from either an individual organization or collaborations between organizations. If you are applying, the organizations that are applying either individually or together, we do expect to see a demonstrated history of work that's aligned with the NYC Green Fund as a whole. I will also point out if you're applying through a joint application, we will ask to see budgetary breakdowns for all participants doing the work. We ask that all applicants follow funder and nonprofit lobbying restrictions, which will come up again as well in ineligible work. And we also welcome government agencies. A government agency just can't be the lead applicant. So with this type of work, it's not unusual to see government agencies as collaborators. They just can't be the lead applicant. So that's something to keep in mind. And if you are a past green or Pathways, but also any Green Fund recipient, we do ask that you have all due reports submitted before requesting additional funding. The reason I got caught up for a second is because based on the current reporting schedule, really what's going to be the most front of mind here is applicants who have been issued a Pathways grant in 2024. We last asked for an interim report, which I have all of the interim reports. There's nobody past due on that, but we will have the final report available to you. I'm working on getting it live in the next week. And then once that goes live, we look for updates in that final report for any returning applicants in 2025. Some applicants were on a 2-year grant structure. And just to be clear, if you're on a 2-year grant term, you would not be reapplying as a lead applicant for another grant this year. You'd wait for that project to complete and then wait till next year. So this would apply to the 1-year grants. And then we can get into the eligible expenses. So I won't go through all of these, but things that come up most commonly, I'll touch on. Staffing costs are eligible within this program, and that does include internships and apprenticeships, and it also includes seasonal work. We can also fund consultants as well and professional fees, and we can fund event costs. Those kind of 3 questions do tend to come up, so I want to make sure that's clear. And with the ineligible expenses, we cannot fund any public programming that is not related to policy change or project piloting within the Pathways program. And just as Emily touched on, and I reiterated, really, you're going to hear that a lot from us today. The emphasis of this program is systems changing work that pertains to one of those key areas of securing that revenue or additional revenue for parks or informing policy. We also cannot fund electioneering, lobbying, or litigation. So we are talking about policy, and that is a line. So if anybody has more specific questions in regards to that lobbying or electioneering, just go ahead and let us know. But yeah, those are the eligible and ineligible. And again, you'll see that when you see that in the guidelines and application. That eligibility sort of quiz format on the application is set up with a logic that won't let you through if you don't meet the eligibility requirements. The hope there is to not waste people's time, so that if there is an aspect of ineligible expenses incorporated into your project, that you know right out the gate, and we're not wasting your time with submitting more work. For the application process, we are doing a 2-year application again this year, just like last year for those familiar. And it'll be so it'll start with the LOI, or the letter of inquiry. That's the piece available on the website right now. That went live on Friday, the 28th, and that'll be open for about a month there. You can submit an LOI up until March 27th at 12 p.m. For those of you who've applied to the Green Fund before, we really try to stay consistent with that 12 p.m. cutoff. I recommend you don't wait until the last minute to submit, just in case there are any tech problems. Open Water, which is our grants management system, should be saving your work continually so that you're not at threat of losing that work, but you do need a secure internet to be able for that to work. So just a heads up there. If we will review LOIs after that close date on the 27th. And if your LOI is deemed to be in alignment with our program priorities, then we'll send out a request for proposal or an RFP, and the full application will be made available to you. And again, I mentioned this earlier in the eligibility, but if you are applying with other groups, just make sure that the budget does include the cost of everybody's work. And as mentioned, the consultations will be available as well. And the link to a calendar for consultations is on the guidelines. We'll share it again today, and those will be available through the 19th of March. And you'll get reminders on these things, but that's just sort of a general overview of what you can expect next. So getting into sort of the funding breakdowns by numbers, we will award up to 8 grants through this Pathways program between $25,000 and $100,000 per grant. per year. The per year is important because we do also issue 2-year grants in addition to 1-year grants. So you can request a 1 or 2-year grant. If you are requesting a 2-year grant, just make sure you're including a timeline for that 2-year grant and your deliverables affiliated with that 2-year timeline as well. And then if you were to be issued a 2-year grant, let's say you did get a grant for $30,000 for a 2-year agreement, then that would be $30,000 in the first year and $30,000 in the second year as well, for a cumulative total of $60,000. Our average grant size in 2024 was $50,000, and the largest grant for Pathways was actually $60,000 last year. So there wasn't as much variance in our grant amounts last year. And it's always a topic of question of, can I apply for the full max amount for the 100,000? And we can certainly get more into that in consultations by project. I would never discourage anyone from applying for what they need. And I also want to be realistic about what the numbers have looked like in this past year. So when you do submit, we just ask that whatever you're asking for is work that would not be possible without this funding from the Green Fund. We'll get into our selection criteria, starting with the strategic alignment here. We're looking for how well our review panel feels that this proposal aligns with supporting our long-term goals with the Pathways program. Tongue twisting, excuse me. We're looking at community served as well, which will consider how well the project helps address the systemic inequities of the public realm. Public realm referring to everything outside of your private home space, private workspace. So how are we addressing the inequities that we all can recognize working in this field do exist? When we look at feasibility, we're talking about a clear understanding that the outcomes of the proposal are feasible considering your resources, your relationships, and your experience. How well positioned is an organization to be doing this work? It's not to say that, you guys really are the experts, and we also want to make sure that if let's say we get an application with a series of collaborators, not only are those roles each clearly defined, but those roles are appropriate based on who is doing which work. And that sort of ties into the next piece, which is that if there are collaborators, it does need to be a meaningful collaboration. We would want to see on the budget and on the deliverables that these roles are very clearly delineated. And getting to the budget, as mentioned on the previous slide, we just want to see that there is a clear and pressing funding need. So in my earlier words, that this work would not be possible without this funding from the Green Fund. And as in our other programs across the Green Fund, both grassroots and treetops, we can only extend a grant amount for no more than 25% of a group's operating budget. So that's our selection criteria. Those are sort of our baseline requirements of how we're seeing the work stack up against our program guidelines. We also do have some program priorities. I want to be clear that these are not required. These are not synonymous with eligibility. These are simply priorities that we might be looking at when we're talking about things like systemic inequities. And alternatively to that, if your project does include these things, it does not guarantee that you would get funding. So we're looking at if this work impacts parks property. With systems change, we also see open space, as we've mentioned. And one of the examples that I'll use today deals directly with open space outside of parks. So again, that's an example of a priority not necessarily always be, informing directly the outcome of a decision. But the Green Fund across the board does prioritize NYC Parks property. And we also are looking at whether your organization or the collaboration of organizations are led by a majority of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So it's again something that we factor into our decision and is not a hard requirement. Getting along to some examples, which are, I think, the really fun parts to talk about of this. So I have a few examples for you today. Tried to pull a sort of variants of examples. This is not the full list of grantees. We do also have, as you likely saw in the guidelines, we linked out to some reports and publications by past grantees as well. So I welcome you all and encourage you all to check those out. This is just sort of a deeper look at what was proposed and what was delivered in more of a summary form. And we can start with Center for an Urban Future, who their work was proposing to research some ways in which we could harness new and sustainable funding for parks and open spaces. Sustained funding being an important detail there, not just raise funds for next year, but how can we actually create a long-term solution that will create more funding in the future as well. And their deliverables included a report titled Paying for the Growing Needs of NYC's Parks, 20 Fresh Ideas to Fund Parks and Open Spaces. They also were able to present those ideas in early 2024 through a great presentation and panel discussion. So those ideas are really helping generate some further explorations, and it's actually led into their successive project to this, which is looking at a ticketing surcharge, which was in that initial 20 ideas and is something that they're now diving deeper into with further research and understanding of what that could look like in a more concrete fashion. Brooklyn Greenways Initiative is our next example, and this is who I was referring to when I mentioned this being open space, but not necessarily parks. Brooklyn Greenways Initiative is responsible for a lot of greenway on the Brooklyn waterfronts, and in their proposal of 23, they proposed a completion of the Greenway Master Plan, and they proposed the planning of federally grant funded efforts to communities that were the most in need. And their deliverables included a pilot user study, lots of data collection that led to that. And it was a pilot user study on Brooklyn's waterfront Greenway corridor. And they also were able to deliver a Greenways coalition strategy and implementation plan. And they were able to host another Greenway Summit, which was not their first. And I don't know if anybody was able to attend that Greenway Summit. It was really informative. It engaged policymakers, nonprofits, advocates, and grassroots organizations. And it was a broader conversation around what transportation can look like in the city as well. We'll move along to our last example here, which is Design Trust, and their proposal included their proposal included how to remove red tape, the limitations or the barriers between people and parks, streets, open spaces in general. And they're looking at specifically indemnification and insurance requirements, as well as permitting challenges. I've heard from a lot of groups that the permitting challenges are very real when they're trying to host events and create that public engagement. And so Design Trust is looking at ways in which we can move through that and really make the process more user and community friendly so that we can get more people in the parks. Their deliverables included the creation of policy and regulatory recommendations for improvements, and it included an economic analysis of missed opportunity costs. So, a lot of these, as you're noticing a trend, these deliverables really can't be produced without pretty extensive research, a lot of interviews, a lot of meeting with city representatives. A lot of these deliverables, you know, what's summarized in these very brief bullet points is the product of a lot of work across months and years to understand as informed of a capacity as possible. What are some feasible steps forward, ways in which we can work with the city to reduce these barriers to our parks and open spaces? And with that in mind, just with consultations with Pathways, I get a lot of clarifying questions around is it that you all are looking for? How do you define these two key program areas of policy change or securing revenue? And I would just really encourage people to keep in mind with those examples, what are some themes that you notice there? The scope and impact of the work really does with this program needs to be citywide, which is unique to treetops, right? Because with treetops, while we do have some people that are working across the city and NYC Bird Alliance, we do have folks that are working across the city, but that's not that is important and unique from this systems changing work, which would impact things from that more systems change approach. We, as I mentioned at the end of the last slide, we are looking at the product of a lot of research and data collection. We're looking at a lot of planning, you know, the master plan with BGI. We're looking at a lot of meetings with city representatives, and there are a lot of people in this city with you know, that are subject matter experts on things like permitting, on things like plaza access. And so we're looking for a lot of collaboration in order to instill a really long-standing sense of systems change. The reporting is obviously a big part of it. And with that reporting, we don't want to be in a vacuum here. We don't want to just be, as City Parks Foundation, as the NYC Green Fund, the ones who see the results and the success of a lot of your hard work. We also expect there to be a capacity of sharing out with your own community what your findings were as well. All right, so we can get along to some questions. And I know that we just provided a lot of information to you all. I'm trying to check in on the chat as well. I don't see any questions there yet, but please do feel free to submit any in the chat. I will start with some questions that I get often, and then maybe kick it off from there. But some questions we got last year, some questions I get throughout consultations, and have even started getting this year is, you know, really what constitutes eligibility. The most common theme as it relates to the Pathways program is that it needs to be work that impacts the entire city on a systems level. And as Emily touched on, that can present itself in a myriad of ways. We don't necessarily need it to look one specific way. We just want to make sure that the work that is being funded through the Pathways program is truly systems changing work rather than, you know, the more stewardship and programmatic type work that you would see across our other programs, which we are very fortunate to have as well. It's just a different program. Another question that I get is if a group can apply for multiple grants. And if you're in Pathways, we haven't set up limitations necessarily. So if you want to apply for a project idea, you can actually apply as lead applicant. You can apply as lead applicant on multiple applications if you do have truly unique projects. And I think what I see more often in pathways is maybe somebody might apply as a lead applicant and they might also be included in another application, not as a lead applicant, but as a collaborator. We welcome that as well. Of course, we still look to see all of the eligibility requirements are met with the budget and with the clear and pressing funding needs with the delineation of roles with collaborators. All right, I have been talking plenty. I do want to make sure that we open up to some other questions, hoping that what we started with kind of help folks, get an idea of what we're able to cover. But I welcome anybody to either get off of mute or indicate in the chat if you have any questions at this time. Iris, I hear really faint talking, but I can't hear very clearly. Did you have a question, Iris?
Yeah, I wanted to find out what exactly is the project piloting. I saw that in one of the pages that you brought up.
So that, and coming back to what Emily was talking about things really taking a different form, sometimes in this work we might see an idea is a new idea, right? So actually on one of the I think it was BGI's work, they included a pilot user study. It would be an example of something that hasn't necessarily been done yet. So that pilot user study was able to inform the ways in which greenways across Brooklyn are used, which can inform the ways in which we continue to design greenways. So that's not necessarily something that is done every single year, and there's somebody within the city whose job it is to do that. That was BGI saying, hey, we think that this could help connect community to city and result in more community informed design. So that's one example. But here, let me pull up the exact language to make sure I'm addressing it as well. But we've also got some other projects that are working new ideas in how city spaces are designed. So maybe there's a larger group that's working with small organizations to understand what their specific neighborhood in Staten Island or in South Queens, what their community's vision is for a park within that space. And maybe they're replicating that across neighborhoods as well. So we do leave room for work like that to be done. The emphasis there, however, is that it would be intended to be a model that other people could also work off of, if that makes sense. So the pilot work can show itself in a range of ways, but the idea is that, with this work, we acknowledge that a lot of this is unfolding stones that might take, they might not. And what does the research process look like, the reporting process look like, and how are you sharing that out with community and other groups to potentially replicate it?
Okay. Now, one thing that I didn't see anything, and maybe I missed something, was do we have to be 501c3 in order to qualify for a grant?
So we, through the Green Fund, for this program, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see applications from groups without a 501c3 as the lead applicant. And Emily, I know that's so there's always fiscal sponsorship as an option is the outright answer there. But coming back to how well a group is positioned to be doing this work, oftentimes, so what's the feasibility of this work and this project proposed? Oftentimes, we see that it comes down to nonprofits who have been committed to this work, who have their process of research, community engagement, report sharing, event hosting, that they have all of that dialed. So it's not to say that it's impossible for somebody to sign up with a fiscal sponsor, but it is to say that we would want to have conversations around what your experience of the systems change level work looks like.
Okay. I'm only asking because we've missed out on applying for grants because we are not 501c3. And then when we started to look into it, it seems like there's a cost factor involved. And we didn't have no funds to even go in that direction. So we kind of just, left it alone and just, play it by ears. There'll be other ways, other opportunities maybe where we don't have to be 501c3 in order to be able to get some grant. I mean, we were able to get something from our Councilwoman Adams, and we had very successful botanical workshops with the funds she provided. But we want to continue it, so.
Hi, Iris. This is
Um,
Emily Caird with City Parks Foundation. I'm happy to chat with you further about, pursuing 501c3 status or fiscal sponsorship and what that looks like. I can
mhm.
drop my email in the chat so that you and I
Okay.
can talk one-on-one offline if that works on your end.
Yes.
I know
Okay.
we've got some more questions coming into the chat, and I don't want us to run out of time.
No. You're good. Thank you.
All right, and then I also see a question from Robin regarding, can you speak more about the revenue generation you mentioned? Heather, I'm gonna pass it to you just because I've been talking quite a bit, and I know you are deeply familiar with Cuff's work.
The idea behind revenue generation is to identify other ways to fund the Parks Department in particular, although also perhaps parks nonprofits, but the priority is the agency itself, that is not reliant upon basic tax dollars. So if you look at the Cuff report, for example, and one of the recommendations that they're making is charging $1 on stadium tickets. There are other suggestions in there around concessions revenue, or other keeping concessions revenue within the agency rather than having it go into the city's general fund. So it's any idea that would bring in other kinds of funding for the Parks Department that's not just basic tax dollars. Robin, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Heather. All right, I'm just gonna keep going in order here. Johnny, I see that you asked about environmental STEM programs. So this program, Pathways, unique from Treetops, is not focused on programming and activation of public spaces. It's focused on that system change work centered on that, finding new forms of revenue for these spaces in a sustained capacity and informing policy in ways that reduce barriers to these spaces. So I tend to see more of the STEM, any type of programming, in this case, the STEM programming, that might be a better fit for Treetops, where we are looking at programming in parks and open spaces, that community engagement, and that is the basis of that program. This is unique from that, in that we're looking for systems changing work. So STEM programs alone might not be the best fit for the systems changing work. We'd want to look more at ways in which, yeah, I unless I never want to speak too absolutely, because maybe there's an idea that you have brewing that, is tying that into ways in which that informs policy regarding parks and open spaces. So I always leave that door open for if you want to reach out to me directly, but just programming alone would not qualify for this Pathways program. All right. I'm looking at the chat and I don't see more questions coming in. And I usually try to keep an eye on if people raise their hand. I'm not seeing anyone, and please do feel free to hop in if you have a question. But if we don't have more questions, we can go ahead and move on to next steps here. So you are able to set up consultations up through March 20th with me. So you can reach out to NYC Green Fund at cityparksfoundation.org. There's a link that we can drop in the chat as well. That's a Gmail calendar link that has blocked out timeframes that I can offer those consultations. So we'll make sure to share that here as well. Let me pull it for you guys. It's the same link that was in the guidelines, to be clear, but let me pull it. And then in terms of any questions that you continue to have, which feel free, if you're more of a person who wants to talk through it face to face, please do feel free to set up a consultation. You're also welcome to reach out via email. And we could also just set up a phone call if that's preferred as well, rather than a full video consultation. Really, it's important to me that I'm meeting you guys in the way that you prefer. So I will be available between now and the 20th for that, any questions or consultations. And then for those of you, when you sign up for the webinar today, we asked if you wanted your information to be shared with other webinar participants who also selected to have their information shared. Reason that we offer that is that Pathways program is so collaborative that we do want to offer some form of connection and collaboration should that be helpful to you all. What that's going to look like is I'll just share out a list of folks who opted in to share that information. And if you see someone on there that you think, hey, they're really involved in this type of work that, we're trying to work alongside, then you're welcome to reach out to them. So I will make sure to follow up and share that list with everyone who has opted in. And then, as mentioned up top, the recording of the webinar will be made available on our website, on our YouTube channel. And the deadline is on the 27th at noon. If you have any tech issues leading up to that, the sooner you reach out, the better. People are usually really good about that. But just please let me know. Questions pertain to anything programmatic or technical. So just feel free to reach out. And then you will know by the end of April if you'll know whether or not you're invited to submit a full application by then. And I, as always, will try to make myself as available as possible to talk through any projects that were not approved to move on as well. Now, Emily, Heather, Max, or Billy, did you have anything you wanted to add before we wrap? All right. Well, those are the Pathways guidelines for 2025, and we're really excited to see you all. We're really excited at the interest in the program, and I hope that I hear more from you all if you think that your project might be in line with what we went over today. And thank you all very much for joining and taking the time out, and just please do feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.